Hey everybody, it's Onepeg. Apologies for the difference in audio, sounds, and possibly even quality. I'm using a Blue Yeti Pro microphone while I'm on vacation with my family, and there is a little bit of background noise because there's some window AC units going on in the cottage that we're staying in. Anyway, I do have a full streaming setup set up here, and now that I'm getting back into Tarkov with New World kind of being on hiatus, I wanted to get back into some updates that have happened recently in the community with podcasts and changes to gun stuff, and just kind of go through what the major points were. So I'm sorry for not having a whole bunch of cool effects and everything, but I'm running bare bones minimum today. All right, boys? But, as always, if you're relatively new here, if you're catching news from me for, the first time maybe, I do these updates on a very regular basis. So if it's something that you enjoy and want to know more about Tarkov-related stuff, and maybe even want to get into the New World content once that goes live on September 28th, please do me a solid and sub the channel. Thanks. So aside from some database changes and updates with some language localization changes with task, mission, quest names, there were some ammo modifications and some modifications to some weapon systems that I think ended up being overall generally a buff. But there were some nerfs kind of across the board for a few things. In addition to all the in-game changes, there was also a podcast with Nikita with a couple of things that I think were pretty important. And there were also a couple of changes to some hideout upgrades that I think stand to be discussed. Okay, so starting off with the small stuff. First up, the RB PS81 and PS82 keys are now PSV1 and PSV2. If you see that difference, now you know. There were some ergonomics nerfs across the board for sound suppressors, for just about every single sound suppressor that exists in the entire game. These nerfs range anywhere from 3 ergo on a couple of the rifle ones to 1 ergo for integrated sound suppressors to 6 ergo for the larger muzzle brakes and compensator combos. Suffice to say that the ergonomics across the board for anything that is suppressed is going to be a little bit more janky to handle. However, because of these ergonomics changes that were across the board for suppressors, there were some requirements that were eased a bit on the gunsmith tasks that required suppressors. Most notably Gunsmith 4, which is now 48 ergo from 51, Gunsmith 8, which is 42 ergo from 45, Gunsmith 10, which is 43 ergo from 48, Gunsmith 14, which is 44 from 47, and Gunsmith 16, which is 40 down from 44. This also coincides with the gunsmith tasks and stuff that was on the wiki. They ended up not having to modify anything, so all of the gunsmith task guides that are on the wiki still work and are relevant if you have been following those to make your builds. Now, for all of the suppressors, there were also a few additional changes. The AAC SDN 762x51 sound suppressor had its accuracy decreased by 1%. Its durability burn was also nerfed by 16%, and the ergo was, double penalized to now be negative 26 instead of negative 25, which it was before. The SIG SRD 762x51 suppressor also had its recoil nerfed by 3%, and the ergo again double nerfed down to 24 negative. Last but not least, there was also some changes to the Mutant. There were 2 rounds of nerfs to the base recoil of the Mutant. So originally the Mutant was 421 horizontal and 164 vertical, and that has now been double nerfed. Now the Mutant's recoil horizontal is 440 and vertical is 188. This doesn't sound like a whole heck of a lot until you start looking at all the weapon attachments and stuff and realize that what was once 38 minimum vertical recoil is now somewhere around 55 to 58, depending on how expensive you want to make your build. Onward from there were some things that were changed with flash hiders that were relatively minimal. The Sig Sauer Micro and 3-prong flash hiders and muzzle brakes had their recoils nerfed by 2 and 3%. The VSS and the AS Val had their recoils improved by 10 points on both horizontal and vertical so that improved it by quite a bit. The Ash 12 actually got a pretty substantial buff from 490 down to 450 horizontal and 155 vertical recoil down from 180. And then kind of cumulatively, there were some buffs to the base weapon systems for the MCX and just about every one of the AK variants. So the MCX had its barrel recoils improved. The 171mm barrel got improved by 2%. The 300 Blackout 229mm barrel got its recoil improved by 3%. And then the base weapon system had its horizontal and vertical recoils both improved. Horizontal was improved from 420 to 405 and the vertical from 162 to 159. On top of this, the Blackout AP round had its armor damage improved to 65% from 60. Its durability burn improved by 10% to 150% from 160. And the penetration chance of the round was improved by a single point. Basically, the idea here is that they're trying to make the MCX rival the 103 and 104 and the AKM and obviously the Mutant, because right now, even with one fully built out, it just doesn't seem to hold a candle to a really well-built AK. The AKs with 7.62 BP rounds kind of take a big steaming dump all over the MCX right now. Okay, now for the AK variant changes, all of the 5.45 and 5.56 AKs had their vertical recoils, their base vertical recoils improved. Now, it wasn't by much, but it is a pretty much global buff across the board. These vertical recoil buffs ranged anywhere from 3 points to 6 points of vertical recoil. It still ends up being something though. From here we also have 5.45 muzzle brakes and 7.62 muzzle brakes. So the AK-74 base muzzle brake, the PWS CQB, the AK-101 muzzle brake, the 104 muzzle brake, and the 74M muzzle brake all were modified. Some of these were buffs and some of these were nerfs, depending on which one you're looking at. And we've been seeing this for a while now. The base recoil of the AK platforms and their associated basic parts have just not held a candle to the equivalent parts of something that gets even minorly built up like you would see with an M4. Now lastly here for the in-game modification changes, we have armor stuff. So the NFM Thor integrated carrier was improved in its speed penalty from 36% to 28%. Fort armor, the 6B43 Zabralo, its speed penalty was improved to 35%, and the Gen 4 full body armor had its speed penalty improved to 24%, down from 33%. So that takes care of like the in-game armor and guns stuff. The last piece here that was changed relatively recently via this cryptic tweet that looked like somebody was having their DMs snatched away was a BSG tweet that went out talking about how the vendors were getting different suppliers for keys. What this really ended up meaning was that vendors like Therapist, who traditionally paid the most for keys, is now paying about 50% less. Okay, now moving on to out of game, and this is really like the larger, I guess, story here, has to do with a short podcast that Klean did with Nikita and Lucas Botkin of T-Rex Arms. Now, there was a lot of discussion about, just shooting guns and building up cool stuff and things that Nikita liked and, that kind of stuff, just kind of shooting the shit, but there was some moments that had to do with in-game Tarkov-related stuff. The first major thing that was discussed had to do with Nikita talking about suppressors stacking on top of compensators inside of the game and how there's like this stacking recoil buff. Now, Nikita defended this position and said that even though he had tested guns that used compensators and then also adding a suppressor to certain compensator combos, that the addition of the suppressor did improve the recoil of the gun pretty markedly. The larger thing that was discussed here, though, and the thing that seemed to make some ripples in the community had to do with VoIP being added to 12.12. Now, Nikita is pretty hell-bent on VoIP being added in 12.12. It's something that he very much wants to see in the game, but that comes with some restrictions. I don't think that this meant like what people could say to each other on the microphone, making like little noises or whispering or, shouting obscenities or anything of the like. I mean, in the heat of it, you can yell or say whatever it is that you want. You can talk all the trash that you want. I mean, that's just what people will do. But he did mention something about trolling meeting severe penalties like being banned. But I think to him, he means trolling insofar as like using third-party software or programs or even hardware to modify your ability to play sounds or music or whatever over the VoIP system. In this case, there's the ability to play like fake sounds that come from the game, like grenade explosions or death noises or bullets, crazy things like playing Fortunate Son running down a hallway in customs or something, if you really wanted to. Now, whether or not this has any level of appropriateness in the game, I'm not going to try and pass judgment. Obviously, this is one of those things that ends up ruining immersion. I mean, we can all kind of agree on that. I don't think that somebody would be realistically running through a hallway with a boombox on their shoulder trying to shoot an enemy. But in a real-world tactical scenario, I don't think that we would see something like that. That being said, this is a video game, and there is something to be said about people using VoIP the way that they're going to use VoIP and how they want to. We've never seen anything historically in a game that I can recall where people were being banned for an abuse of the voice over IP systems that existed inside of a video game. It's kind of difficult to police. Then, of course, there's the argument that the community has already been making where BSG has a hard enough time to be able to ban people that are cheating, so they feel. So what's to say that they're even going to be able to keep up with all of the reports that could come through with people abusing the VoIP system? And to an extent, I have to agree with that. I think that when it comes to VoIP, yes, of course, it could break immersion, but there's always something to be said about people wanting to just have a good time and enjoy the game that they paid for. I guess my point is that I can see both sides of this. Obviously, you guys are going to have your own opinions, so please feel free to share them. At any rate, that's what I have for this video, guys. Thanks so much for taking the time to view it. I will obviously see you in the next one. Apologies again for the quality of the audio, but we'll be back in the studio recording things like we normally do once I'm back in town next weekend. Thanks.